We're watching testimony from the Kendhammer case. Kendhammer found guilty last night at 9:05 p.m. by the jury. We have Jeff Williams, our freelance producer, who was in the courtroom through the whole trial. Jeff, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so interested to hear about what was happening in that courtroom. Before we get to the verdict, though, let's go back and talk a little bit about the trial. What did you see from the family members? Were there family members present from both Kendhammer and the victim's family?
I'm sorry, ma'am, you cut out on me there at the last
second. I apologize. We must be having a technical difficulty. How were the family members reacting to the trial as it was unfolding?
Everybody was very supportive of Todd. He had all of the family behind him, including his mother-in-law and the brothers. Everybody was standing behind Todd as being innocent. Both his son and his daughter had testified on the stand, and everybody was very much in his support throughout the trial.
Wow, was there a lot of emotion in that courtroom? Could you feel the emotion from the family?
Very much so, very much so. Everybody was very, very defending of Todd, that he, based on their relationships and based on the experience they had had, that everybody couldn't believe that he was possibly capable of committing murder.
Wow, that's so interesting. You have such insight when you're actually in the courtroom and you're seeing the people sitting there watching the trial. Did you hear anything from the victim's family as the case was unfolding?
Well, the victim's family stood behind Todd as not unable to believe that he was capable of doing this.
Wow.
So they continued to take the stand and stood behind him, not believing that he could have committed murder and that this was just a tragic accident.
Wow. So as we were watching the trial here, of course, you had the benefit of being in the courtroom. We're just watching it. We're watching just the trial. We're not able to see the reactions of the jurors or the people in the galley. How did Todd Kendhammer come off during his testimony? He was actually on the stand. You very rarely hear from the actual defendant in a trial. What did you think of his testimony sitting there in the courtroom?
Well, Todd was very, very anxious to get up there and to explain himself. He wanted to tell his story, even after being advised several times that you do not have to defend yourself. He wanted to get up there and explain his story. Now, during the course of all the interviews, he had changed his story specifically 3 times. So he was questioned on, why are you changing the story? You're lying about your story. And he was very, very nervous. You could definitely see that. A lot of the leg shaking, which was seen in the interviews and the other footage that had been shot. Very, very nervous, but wanting to get up and speak.
Right. Oh, that's very interesting. And yes, the rule is that the defendant has the choice. It's their choice whether or not they want to take the stand. And oftentimes the lawyers say, I don't think it's a good idea, or maybe give them advice not to, but he took the stand, and now we know why from your insights. Another issue that came up in this case that I really think was critical to the outcome were the expert witnesses. What did you see from the jury in the courtroom during the expert testimony?
The expert testimony was interesting. They called up a glass expert, an individual known as Mark Mechlin, and his website is, I want to say, ChicagoWindowExpert.com. His qualifications are very on-the-job type of training. He didn't have a professional degree in anything related to glass or being a glass expert. He had, I believe it was a social work degree from many years ago. And so his analysis, he was questioning much of what the state crime lab had presented as facts. And he just didn't, I really got the impression from the jury on that he was speaking a little bit above his qualifications. Another person that was called in was Dr. Barry Bates, who is an adjunct professor in Las Vegas. Now, he had his degree from Oregon State, I believe, and was a biomechanics expert, but definitely not someone who was qualified to diagnose or analyze the images presented of, the injuries Barb Kendhammer had sustained. And the third expert witness, which they called Dr. Cook, which he's an individual from northern Wisconsin, was an emergency room doctor who is now currently a doctor in a nursing home. Again, he had been an emergency room doctor for almost 10 years, so his qualifications were somewhat questionable at being able to analyze, pathology and other things there. In his career, I believe he was stated as having 3 homicide accidents that he had worked on over the course of 40 years, maybe. So when all of these individuals were testifying, I did definitely notice the jury was feeling a little disconnected from their expert testimony, just feeling like, they, after the crime lab had given all of their statements, that we just didn't have, the expert that you would expect to see in a case of this magnitude.
Absolutely, and the expert testimony here was really critical, as you articulated. A lot of the evidence that came forward was about whether or not her injuries could have been sustained in the way Kendhammer had described the accident. So obviously those expert witnesses were very critical to the case. Now, you had a very long day yesterday. Jury goes out for deliberations 11:36 in the morning, and a verdict returned at 9:05. Jeff, take me through the mood in the courtroom as the jury left for deliberations.
Well, when everybody went out, most everybody had stayed here and was waiting. There was really no idea at how long the jury might be out. And the mood in general, like I said, everybody that was there was in support of Todd. The state really had nobody that was, family members or people who were, thinking he had done this. So as the family and the friends gathered out there, there was a lot of laughing, a lot of talking, a lot of nervous energy. I definitely got that. As, 3, 4, 5 hours rolled through, all of a sudden it was getting very much darker. People were spreading out, and questions coming out, I'm sure, from within. What is the jury thinking? When we started getting closer to the verdict, things were much quieter in the courthouse. At one point, we actually had a deputy come in and say, there are offices on this floor. I understand there's a lot of people here, but if we could kind of keep it down. With that earlier positive energy, had later gotten very, very quiet and much darker. Right before we all went back into the courtroom to hear the verdict, Todd had gathered with his family and was, giving hugs to everyone. When he went into the courtroom, he was holding his granddaughter, and a very much an emotional moment, and you could really feel that. Then everybody sat down, and when the verdict came back in, I believe everyone was genuinely shocked. I think that they really thought it was going to be an innocent or not guilty verdict.
Wow, it's interesting to know that everyone in the courtroom was in his support. So when that verdict was read, what happened? How did the family members react?
Okay, well, initially, Todd had turned around and was looking at the children and the granddaughter, but once the verdict was made, he was not allowed to hug, make any physical contact, or even speak with the family. So things got very, very dark right there. He was handcuffed by the deputies and escorted out of the courtroom, at which point the family began, everyone went out in a very large group. I went downstairs. We were asked not to do any filming on the court level or any interviewing up there. So we came down to the entryway of the courthouse with myself and a local journalist. At that point, when they came off of the elevator, the family was very, very upset. They were screaming vulgarities at us, cursing at myself, the cameraman, and the journalist, and telling us that the verdict was our fault, that as if the media portrayal of him had then cast the guilty verdict. So we were told that it was our fault, we were being cursed at, and the journalist that I was working with was actually overtaken by the family and shoved into the courthouse doors. It was a very emotion-fueled moment, and they were not happy or wanting to speak with us whatsoever.
Oh, wow. That sounds like a very, as you said, an emotion-fueled moment resulting in somebody being shoved. Obviously, the tensions were running very high with the family. That you have great insight from being in the courtroom. Now, Jeff, what do you think? Did you think he was guilty? Were you leaning towards that way after watching the trial unfold?
Well, and honestly, I wanted to hear all of the facts. This story, there is a lot of question on, how could this have happened? How do the physics and the mechanics of this work? So I truly wanted to hear all of, everything that the defense had to present and everything that the state had to present. My feeling was guilty. I really felt like this happened, and there's more to the story than we're seeing here. But that I believe it was a tragic accident, I guess, for lack of a better term. I don't believe there's any premeditation into this, but I think once things started in that adrenaline rage-fueled incident, that it just got out of control and in an instant.
Yes, and the jury agreed with you. The jury agreed that there was more to the story.
And a big part of the testimony coming from both of the children, I noticed in the son's testimony, he was very emotionless, or very stone, I guess, to describe him on the stand. He just was very still, and the daughter was. You really got a genuine sense of sadness out of her. She had lost her mother. It really changed. And it's something I hope that they can look back on after. As she went up there as a very innocent and calm person, but after the verdict came through, she was very upset, and she was. These people were in the group of family that overtook the reporter and had shoved her into these doors. And all very upset, screaming things that I don't think anybody would normally say to somebody else on the street. And so for me, I hope that they're able to look back at this and say, I'm not the kind of person who would be rude, say negative things to somebody, in such a harsh and abrasive way. But look what the emotions, the adrenaline, look what happened. Look at what I did, and how I was acting based on, this type of news and something bad. And I hope that they can look at that into then what happened with their father, because I genuinely don't believe that he went into it with the intent to harm Barbara. But, once things happened, the snowball effect.
Right, and certainly you bring up a good point that the children really are victims here, because for them it's sad all the way around. They've lost their mother, and now their father is in prison. So hopefully there's other family members who will embrace the children and be able to work through their issues. Obviously, an emotion-fueled moment, as you described it.
Absolutely, and it at those last moments before the verdict, when I seen him hugging the family, when I seen him, embracing the granddaughter and hugging, and it was heartbreaking. It genuinely was. I mean, all things considered, they're still human beings who have to go on with their life, and now with the loss of not one but two parents.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for your insights in the courtroom. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure working with you.
Thank you. We're going to go back into more of the Kendhammer case. Some excellent insights from Jeff Williams, our freelance producer, sitting in that courtroom during the emotion-fueled reading of the verdict. We heard a very, very interesting information from Jeff about the trial, and especially about the change in the mood and dynamic from 11:30 in the morning when the jury began deliberations until 9 p.m. at night. A long day of hours of deliberations resulting in a guilty verdict. We've been watching testimony from the Kendhammer case today, including Todd Kendhammer's testimony on the stand. As Jeff articulated, his testimony was highly criticized by the prosecution as being not credible, pointing out many inconsistencies in his story, and credibility is key to a jury. Another interesting piece of information that we received from Jeff was the view of the expert testimony and seeing the jury a little bit lost during that time. And as we were talking about this case, it really does seem that the expert testimony was critical, especially the defense expert conceding that the victim's injuries could have been sustained in the way that the prosecution was presenting the case. So excellent insight by Jeff. We're going to dive back into the Kendhammer case, and we're going to review more testimony now.